Messiah. You're the Son of God. And in a sense, he's absolutely right. That is the right answer. And then we're told that Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man, that's him, he must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed, and after 3 days he must rise again. And Peter's response, even though he absolutely gets it right that Jesus is the Messiah, what he thinks it means for Jesus to be Messiah, he's totally misunderstood. He just has no framework whatsoever for Jesus to be the Messiah and yet at the same time be rejected and killed. So Peter takes Jesus aside to rebuke him. They're just this idea of a Messiah being crucified just wasn't on people's agenda. And it's still hard even today. This was a famous and controversial statement that a Christian writer called Steve Chalk made about 10 years ago in a book called The Lost Message of Jesus, where he basically said that, if this idea that Jesus died on the cross in order to pay for people's sins, if that's true, he compared it to cosmic child abuse. He said the fact is the cross isn't a form of cosmic child abuse, a vengeful father punishing his son for an offense that he has not even committed. Understandably, both people inside and outside the church have found this twisted version of events morally dubious and a huge barrier to faith. And even deeper than that, he says, is the concept that this idea of Jesus dying on the cross to pay for people's sins stands in total contradiction to the idea that God is love. It's difficult to get our heads around it. And again, everybody's favorite atheist, probably the most famous atheist in the world, Richard Dawkins, looks at this idea of Jesus dying on the cross and he says it's vicious, it's sadomasochistic, it's repellent. We should dismiss it as barking mad, but for its ubiquitous familiarity. In other words, like if we actually stood back and thought about this, we would see that it was utterly ridiculous. He says, if God wanted to forgive our sins, then why not just forgive them? Why can't God just, click his fingers and just forgive people's sins without having himself tortured and executed in payment for those sins? And so added to that is even this idea that, okay, if this was an accident, if this had kind of not been part of the agenda, then fair enough. But according to Christianity, the cross was not an accident of unforeseen circumstances. Jesus actually said, no one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and to take it up again. In other words, what Jesus was saying was actually the cross wasn't just this blip, this embarrassing blip on God's cosmic plan to save people. It was actually central to everything that Jesus came to do and to be. In fact, C.S. Lewis, the great author, put it this way in Mere Christianity. He said, what did Jesus come to do? Well, to teach, of course. And we all know that. We all think that the stuff Jesus taught is pretty good, no matter whether we would call ourselves Christians or not. And then he says this, but as soon as you look into the New Testament or any other Christian writing, you'll find that they are constantly talking about something different, not just his teaching, but his death and his coming to life again. He says, it is obvious that Christians think the chief point of the story lies here. They think the main thing that Jesus came on earth to do was to suffer and be killed. And that kind of connects with the eyewitness testimonies of Jesus, the Gospels that we have, because in the middle of Luke's Gospel kind of divides into two parts, and a lot of it is just about Jesus' healings and Jesus' teachings, but the whole second half is about Jesus's journey to the cross. And it turns on this verse in verse 51 when it says, when the days drew near for him to be taken up, in other words, to be taken up to the cross, Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. In other words, he knew it was coming. He didn't shuck it. He absolutely walked towards it openly and committed. So the cross is central to Christianity. And from the very, very beginning, Christians, from the eyewitnesses right to today, think that one of the reasons why it's central and one of the reasons why it's significant is because it was the greatest demonstration of love that the world has ever seen. The cross is not just a religious symbol, it was the greatest display of love that the world has ever seen. In fact, one of Jesus' own disciples put it this way in a later letter that he wrote. He said, "This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us." In other words, what he was saying is this: it's not just that the cross of Jesus is a really good example of love. So love kind of exists independent as a definition, and then the cross is just like a really good analogy of love. He said, no, the cross is what defines love. It's what actually enables us to know what love is. And every other expression of love has to take its lead from that definition. This Viktor Frankl was he was a psychologist, basically, and he was a Jew, and he ended up in a concentration camp under the Nazi regime. And he wrote a book about his experience in the concentration camps called Man's Search for Meaning. And he wrote this as part of that book. He said, life in a concentration camp tears open the human soul and exposes its depths. In other words, experiences of deep trauma and pain and pressure and suffering expose what's really going on in the depths of our hearts. Sigmund Freud, another psychologist, put it this way. He said, when you are pushed to your limit, the real you comes out. And I think that's significant, because I think because the story of Christianity isn't just about why Jesus died, it's also about how Jesus died. Because when Jesus died, he was pushed to his limit. He was literally rejected. He faced all kinds of injustice. He faced all kinds of pressure. And yet when Jesus faced those days leading to his death, what poured out of his soul, what revealed what was in his depth, was love, forgiveness, concern for others. Jesus on the cross looked at those who were mocking him and jeering and thinking the whole thing was a big charade, something to laugh at, because Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, and look, there he is on the cross. How could that be? And Jesus looked at them and said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do. He had concern for his disciples and for his own mother rather than concern for himself. He had total faith in God, and he had the ability to transform even the lives of a criminal who was being executed justly beside him. How Jesus died was like how no one in all of human history has died. So much so that a centurion who was just literally there doing a job, who probably crucified criminals and people multiple times throughout his life, he knew how people who were guilty died. He knew how human beings reacted when they were pushed to this limit and when they were on the brink of death. And yet what he saw in Jesus was he could only explain this way. He'd never seen a person like this. He'd never heard a person like this. He'd never seen a person die like this. And the only conclusion that he could come to about who Jesus was this, that surely this man was the Son of God. So the cross is the greatest demonstration of love that we have ever seen. And for the few minutes that's left, I just want to give you a couple of reasons why I think that is the case. And the first is because at the cross, Jesus died in order to identify with us in our suffering. Henri Nouwen, who was a really influential Christian thinker of the last century, he wrote a book called The Wounded Healer, and he said this: isolation is the worst form of suffering. He said, no one can help anyone without becoming involved, without entering with his whole person into the painful situation, without taking the risk of becoming hurt, wounded, or even destroyed in the process. And of course, that is exactly what we all know happens. That's how we express love and concern when it comes to people suffering. Now, I do share this because I'm a Liverpool supporter. So if you're not a Liverpool supporter, I'm sorry, not sorry. But this phrase and even the song that goes with it has been so influential during the pandemic. And the reason why is because what people need in the midst of suffering and fear and uncertainty and pain is to know that they are not alone in it, to know that they're not isolated, because isolation, as Nouwen says, is the worst form of human suffering. And that is exactly what was going on at the cross. I have a friend called Vince who, when he was 6 years old, was playing. He's from New Jersey in America. When he was 6 years old, he was playing in his front garden with some kids from his neighborhoods, and they were playing like American football. And like all kids do, they were kind of just seeing who was the toughest, and they were kind of roughing each other up. And he was playing with a number of older kids, and he got roughed up pretty bad, so much so that he got upset and he began crying. And he went to his mum, who was around the back of the house, and he was crying through tears. He said to her, "I'm not tough enough. I'm not tough enough." And then his mum did something absolutely crazy. But they are Italian Americans, so who knows? Maybe that explains it. But she crouched down to basically be at his eye line. And she said, "You are tough enough. You are tough enough." And then she said this, "Now punch me in the nose." Bit of a weird thing to say, but she kept on saying it. "Vince, you are tough enough. Punch me in the nose." Now, he went to university and was on the boxing team, so maybe this was the start of his boxing career. But after enough encouragement from his mum, he reared back, and with a straight right, he hit his mum in the face. And to his surprise, his mum kind of stepped back, and blood began to roll down her face. And he managed to make his mum bleed. And despite the mess and the weirdness of all that, his mum then gave him the biggest smile and looked back at him and said this, "Vince, you are tough enough. Now get back out there." And she went inside to clean herself up. Now, Vince told me this story, and he said, look, as weird and as crazy as that was, he said it captured for me the heart of God. Because his mom chose to have him, and she chose to have him knowing that bringing him into this world would mean he could be exposed to evil. But that didn't make her evil. Why? Because when he did suffer and there were tears, she entered into that suffering with him, even to the point of being hurt and injured by her own child. And I think it's the same with Christianity. Christianity is not a religion that says God can only be good if he keeps us from ever having the possibility of suffering. But at the cross, what the cross is all about is a message that when we do suffer, God has not kept himself isolated from it. He hasn't left us to it. He's entered into it, even at the point of suffering with us. John Stott, that famous Christian thinker I told you about, put it this way. This is a bit of a longer quote, but it's a good one. He said this. He said, "I could never myself believe in a God if it were not for the cross. In a real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune from pain? I've entered many Buddhist temples. I've entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of the Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing round in his mouth, and a remote look on his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time after a while, I've had to turn away, and in imagination, I've turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, nails through his hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wretched, brow bleeding from thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me," he says. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh and blood and tears and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of his. There's still a question mark against human suffering, but over it, we boldly stamp another mark, the cross that symbolizes divine suffering. And then he quotes this little poem that says, "The other gods were strong, but you were weak. They rode, but you did stumble to a throne. But to our wounds, only God's wounds can speak. And not a God has wounds, but you alone. Second reason, really quickly, why I think the cross matters and why it's more is because it saves us from sin. Now, I know we don't like to think about this idea of sin. We either kind of trivialize it and turn it into like, if you eat a pizza or if you are on Weight Watchers or something like that and you eat something you shouldn't eat, that's a sin. Versus, sin is like psychopaths. And that's kind of what we're talking about. But sin essentially just means to miss the mark. In other words, there's a mark, there's a standard that we're all meant to meet. And most of us like to think that we meet it, but I think the Bible's really realistic about the fact that we don't. And essentially, I think if you really want to know whether we are people who sin or not, then just turn the lights out, because when the lights are turned out, people behave so differently. Just think about how you behave in the cinema when you don't think you're being watched, when you don't think anybody's there to see you or keep you accountable. We do all kinds of stuff that we're ashamed of. I'm quite into like ethics and technology and things like that. So I quite like this Netflix show called Black Mirror. And I always wondered why it was called Black Mirror. And basically the show's about it's kind of a dystopia. It's basically about technology in the future, but often how things go badly wrong with technology. And some people would say, oh, the problem is technology. If we just didn't have these things, if we didn't have these gadgets, if we didn't have laptops, if we didn't have these things like phones and things like that, and we wouldn't use them for bad. And I think actually what's really honest about a show like Black Mirror is the reason why it's called Black Mirror is because if you turn your laptop off, or if you turn your phone screen off, what you're actually left with is not a picture of me. You're left with a reflective black screen, a black mirror. In other words, what the show is essentially saying is this, that actually the problem isn't technology. It's not that our problems come from the outside. But like Jesus said, actually, the problem is our human nature and how we use technology. And I guess sin is kind of magnified by the holiness of the person whose presence we're standing in. I can remember Amy and I, before we got married, we were kind of really wanting to be honest and share like all of our secrets and just be really open and transparent with each other, so that we went into marriage just really conscience clear and clear about who we were and what we'd done and all of that. I can remember Amy telling me like her worst stuff, and it was like photo stalking on Facebook and things like that, and I felt so sinful, so like immoral in comparison to her. And even though I would have considered myself to be like not as bad as other people and all the rest of it, my sin, my weakness was magnified by the fact that she was actually a much more moral person than me. And I guess if we don't take the standard as other people, like we often do, we like to compare ourselves, and generally we like to consider people who are a little bit worse than us, they're the sinners, but we're okay. But if the standard is Jesus, then none of us measure up. And I guess the cross is where God says that the sins that we've committed and the sins that have been committed against us, it actually matters. And in most religions, if there's this idea of sin and immorality and falling short, in most other religions, mercy or forgiveness is extended at the expense of truth. If I stand before a judge and I'm guilty and the judge decides to show me mercy, I haven't received what I ought to have received. In that sense, mercy has been given at the expense of justice. And this is an idea that's often in contradiction in many religions, particularly in things like Islam and stuff like that. But if justice truly matters, then it demands judgment. But judgment without mercy is devastating. None of us measure up. But mercy without justice is wrong, because justice truly matters. And one of the things that's so significant about the cross is that beyond any other religion or worldview, it brings these two ideas together. It says that how we behave how we mess up, how we miss the mark, that matters. Justice matters. But it says that actually, rather than have anyone pay that justice and face that judgment for themselves, God has done something else, that he has taken it on himself and offers us love and acceptance, so much so that he says, come now, let us settle this matter. Though your sins are like scarlet, they can be white as snow. Though they're red like crimson, they can be like wool. It's one of the Christian writers wrote it this way. He says, Jesus cancelled the charge of our legal indebtedness, which stood against us and condemned us, and he's taken it away, nailing it to the cross. I'm almost out of time, so let me just leave you with two other thoughts about why I think the cross is so significant and why Jesus had to die and why it's the greatest demonstration of love. The third thing is that Jesus, the cross is where God came to save us, not just from sin, but from guilt and shame. I have two other friends who, when they were dating, did something similar to Amy and I. When they were dating, they sort of confessed all their secret habits and confessed, like, just really wanted to be transparent with each other. And my friend's girlfriend confessed to him that she was actually a Trekkie. Now, he didn't know this, and she kind of hid in the stack of Star Trek DVDs and things like that. But she confessed this, and it's quite clear to him. He said to me that, you know, she's pretty embarrassed about it. Like, this is, like, obviously she likes it, but she, you know, sometimes Star Trek guys and fans get a reputation for being geeks or whatever. Or so she was a little embarrassed, and it was a source of shame for her. She thought, you know, he might think less of her or reject her because of it. And it just so happened that not that long afterwards, the new Star Trek movie was at the cinema, and the two of them decided to meet at the cinema. And as they met at the cinema, my friend was already there, and he bought a Star Trek t-shirt with Mr. Spock on it saying "To boldly go," and he was holding a giant poster that was a big Star Trek poster, and he just did it for a bit of a laugh. But rather than like laugh, as his girlfriend walked towards him, she had tears in her eyes, and she gave him the biggest hug. And the reason why they discovered that night, and as they talked about it after, was because this was kind of a source of shame for her. And to see somebody literally wearing her shame, freed her from ever having to be ashamed about it again. And that's kind of the story of the cross and becoming human and dying on the cross. Christianity says that Jesus literally wore our shame so that we would never have to do it, to wear it again. And so in that sense, the cross means that whatever you may have been, you may have in your life that's a source of shame, in whatever way you've personally been shamed by other people, it does not define you, because the cross says that anyone who believes in him will never ultimately be put to shame. Let me wrap this up and just leave you with the last one. The reason why I think it's the greatest demonstration of love, and the reason why Jesus had to die, and the reason why the cross is more than a religious symbol was because it was the way that God makes us children of God. Love is transformative. I don't know if any of you are fans of musicals. I quite like Les Mis, both the book and the musical. And there's obviously the whole story hinges on the character of Jean Valjean, who at the start of the book is a criminal, and he's not like, you know, he's okay. I mean, obviously, like, everybody loves Hugh Jackman in the film, but in the book, like, he's not the nicest guy. And he gets out of prison and he meets, he's taken in by a religious clergyman, and he's given shelter and he's looked after, but he decides that he's going to steal from this guy. And so he steals certain expensive silver candlesticks in order to fund whatever he wants to fund. And of course he's caught, and then he's dragged back by the police. He's basically guaranteed to go back to prison. They bring the candlesticks back to the bishop, and instead of being judged and condemned and rejected, what he realizes is that this bishop is prepared to offer him unconditional forgiveness and actually give him the candlesticks as a gift. And that offering of love, that offering of grace changes you, because real love, real grace does change you. And the thing about Christianity is that the God of Christianity is a personal God. It's very different. The idea of heaven and things like that in the Christian story is very different to ideas of paradise in Islam or ideas of nirvana in Buddhism. Because even though people might go to a paradise in other religions, particularly in Islam, God is not there. And certainly there's no sense of having a relationship with God. But in Christianity, God isn't just simply interested in offering us forgiveness. He's interested in offering us relationship, which is why a quote like this from Richard Dawkins just makes no sense. One, because it doesn't sound like he's interested in forgiveness whatsoever, but it also is because that God is after much more than just forgiving us. He's after relationship and friendship with us. And in order to do that, he's not just going to set us free from our debt, but he's going to give us a new heart so that we take on God's very nature. That's one of the promises that God has given, that he will give us a new heart, a heart that's God-willed, not self-willed, and will put his spirit, his life in us. Let me finish with this. This is a famous book. I don't know if during the pandemic, one of the things that's been kind of trending a lot is little pictures by the artist Charlie Maxey. And he writes this little book. Was just such a feel-good book with little really good, like, pithy truisms. And also they then decided that they would make a t-shirt out of one of his drawings for comic relief and stuff like that. But what some people don't know about Charlie Maxey is before he made these things that became famous during the pandemic, he's a Christian, and he's famous for these pictures, which is his own artist's rendition of a story of love in the Bible, the prodigal son, and then he also does one about the prodigal daughter. And the thing about that is, if you know the story, I think Hannah even mentioned it recently, it's the story of somebody who rejects his father's love, goes out, wastes his life, totally messes up, and then decides that he's going to come back, but he only wants to come back as a servant. That's all he expects. But when he does come back, what he finds is not only is his father prepared to meet him and embrace him and forgive him, but he's prepared to make him a son and an heir all over again, to bring him right back in to being a child rather than just a servant. And I guess that's the story of the cross. The final quote that I have for you guys is this, where John, one of the apostles, said this: "What great love the Father has lavished on us, that we could be called children of God," not just creatures of God, but children of God. Because the same thing, like, is like just giving people forgiveness and putting them into heaven and not actually changing their nature would be like bringing a tiger into your home and expecting it to respect your home and behave like a human being. It doesn't happen. You got to change people from the inside, and that is what the cross promises. So if you're interested in this, if you're interested in finding out more, if this has sparked questions or thoughts, I would encourage you to take a copy, two resources I want to leave you with tonight. A copy of Uncover, where you can, Uncover is basically one of the eyewitnesses' accounts that's historically very, very credible. Historians take this stuff seriously, and it's often known as one of the Gospels. But it's an opportunity for you to look at this life that has stood out among billions of other lives, and a life that stands out among billions is worth looking into, and see for yourself, who was Jesus? What did he say? And why was the cross so significant? And to see, you can get you a copy or you can download it on an app. The other resource is a Bible study resource. If you'd like to know more about how to actually understand the Bible, I have a friend who runs an organization called Word Go, which is basically an app that you have on your phone that provides you with all kinds of resources for getting into the Bible. But anyway, I've taken at least 10 minutes more than I should have, so I want to stop there and we'll jump into questions.